Have you ever noticed how a tornado's destructive power swirls around a perfectly still center? This silent core, what I call the invisible pivot, contains the secret to mastering decisions under extreme pressure. My name is Bruce Lee. What I'm about to share with you isn't found in ancient scrolls or modern psychology textbooks. It emerged in 1967 during a moment of crisis that transformed my understanding of the mind. The film studio in Hong Kong had delivered an ultimatum that threatened everything I had built. Their contract would restrict my artistic expression completely. The American producers offered opportunity, but demanded compromises I couldn't accept. My family needed stability, yet my art required integrity. There was no clear path forward. That night in my hotel room, something unexpected happened. Rather than adding more analysis, more options, more struggle, my mind suddenly shifted to what I now call lightning awareness. A state where time seems to expand, and clarity emerges not from accumulation of thought, but from a precise focusing of consciousness. Most decision methods fail because they address the wrong problem. They attempt to gather more information when information isn't what's lacking. True decision clarity comes from accessing what I call emotional momentum, the directed force of feeling that most try to suppress, but can instead be channeled like electrical current. I developed the invisible pivot method after studying why traditional approaches failed under real pressure. Western methods emphasize accumulating options. Eastern philosophies often suggest detachment. But neither addresses the fundamental mechanism of clarity that emerges at the intersection of stillness and explosive energy. You see, in martial arts, power doesn't come from tension. It comes from the perfect balance between relaxation and focused intent. What appears as a physical principle is actually a universal one. The mind that stays rigid breaks under pressure. The mind that remains centered yet adaptive penetrates any problem. This method isn't about emptying yourself of thought or adding more analysis. It's about finding the invisible pivot point within any situation, the still center around which all possibilities revolve. In Hollywood meetings, I watched executives circle endlessly around decisions, adding more data, more opinions, creating only confusion. In contrast, my approach, finding the invisible pivot, allowed me to see with perfect clarity when others saw only complexity. The invisible pivot method consists of 4 interconnected principles that I've tested against the most demanding situations a man can face. Principles I've refined through fighting, through filmmaking, through navigating between worlds that wanted to define me on their terms. What I'm offering isn't philosophy for quiet contemplation. This is practical methodology for moments when everything is at stake and there are no second chances. A system for achieving what I call decision mastery, the ability to make perfect choices under imperfect conditions. Are you prepared to discover how the invisible pivot transforms confusion into clarity? How momentary stillness creates explosive action? How the mind can learn to intercept problems before they fully form? Then let us begin with the first principle, what I call stop-hit consciousness, the art of intercepting a problem's energy before it fully manifests. Consider the eye of a storm for a moment. While chaos spins violently around it, the center remains perfectly still. This isn't emptiness. It's potentiality in its purest form. The still point doesn't lack power. It directs it. When I began developing this method in 1968, I was working on a film sequence that required a decision between 2 fighting approaches. The Hong Kong choreographers insisted on traditional movements, beautiful but inefficient. The American producers wanted flashy techniques that would sell tickets but lacked authenticity. I was caught between artistic integrity and commercial demands. During an exhausting night of rehearsal, I stepped away from the set and found myself watching a spinning ceiling fan in my dressing room. Something clicked, as I observed how the blade's rotation created a vortex around a motionless center. I realized the solution wasn't choosing between opposing forces, but finding the pivot point around which all options could be arranged. This insight contradicts how most people approach decisions. The Western mind believes better decisions come from accumulating more data, more options, more perspectives. They build elaborate models, complex flowcharts, endless pros and cons. The result? Analysis paralysis or decisions without conviction. Even Eastern traditions often miss the mark. Many teach detachment as separation from the problem. But detachment that distances you from reality creates its own distortion. True clarity doesn't come from stepping away from reality, but from penetrating to its core. Decision mastery isn't about choosing correctly, it's about seeing precisely. When perception is perfect, action becomes inevitable, not through elimination of alternatives, but through recognition of the invisible pivot around which all possibilities arrange themselves. This explains why two fighters facing identical circumstances make radically different choices. The amateur sees chaos and reacts randomly. The master perceives the pattern, the rhythm beneath the apparent disorder, and acts from the still center of awareness. In 1968, while filming The Green Hornet, I faced a director who wanted to change my fighting style to match Hollywood expectations. During our confrontation, I didn't empty my mind of thought. I intensified my awareness until I found what I call the penetration point, the exact spot where his position was vulnerable. Not through aggression, but through a precise redirection of existing energy. The result wasn't compromise or conflict, but transcendence. A solution neither of us had previously considered that preserved artistic integrity while enhancing commercial appeal. The invisible pivot method isn't about following predetermined steps. It's about developing 4 interconnected capabilities that function as a unified whole, like the joints of a body that appear separate but move as one. I call these 4 capabilities stop-hit consciousness, triad perception, broken rhythm mastery, and lightning execution. Together they form not a linear process, but a dynamic system that adapts to any decision context. Unlike conventional approaches that treat pressure as an obstacle, this method transforms pressure into fuel. The greater the pressure, the greater the potential for clarity, provided you know how to locate the invisible pivot within the storm. The first principle of decision mastery I call stop-hit consciousness. In combat, a stop-hit intercepts an opponent's attack before it fully develops. In decision-making, this principle intercepts confusion before it takes root in the mind. Most people attempt to make decisions from a state of mental turbulence. Their thoughts are already in motion, laden with preconceptions, emotional reactions, and societal programming. From this state, clarity is impossible, like trying to see your reflection in churning water. Stop-hit consciousness establishes what I call the position of advantage, a state where perception precedes interpretation. This isn't passive awareness, but an activated readiness that catches reality before the mind distorts it. The technique involves 3 precise elements that must be performed together, not sequentially. First is what I call rhythmic circuit breathing. This isn't meditation breathing taught in temples. I developed this pattern specifically for combat situations where conventional calm breathing fails under pressure. The pattern creates what neurologists now call cognitive coherence, a state where the brain's electrical patterns synchronize. The method is simple, but requires practice. Inhale for a count of 3 through your nose while contracting your lower abdomen. Hold for 1 count while maintaining the contraction. Exhale for 5 counts through slightly parted lips while releasing the contraction in stages. Repeat 3 times exactly, no more, no less. This specific pattern interrupts habitual thought processes by altering oxygen exchange rates in the prefrontal cortex. The physiological change creates a momentary reset of perception, a perceptual silence lasting approximately 1.5 seconds that forms a window for unfiltered awareness. The second element is targeted decontraction, a technique I developed that differs significantly from general relaxation methods popular in California during the early 1970s. Rather than attempting to relax the entire body simultaneously, targeted decontraction follows a precise sequence of release points connected to decision-making centers in the nervous system. Begin with the jaw hinge, the temporomandibular joint, releasing tension while maintaining structure. Then release the nerve center at the base of the skull, where tension accumulates first under pressure. Next, the shoulder complex, specifically the trapezius rhomboid junction, where emotional stress physically manifests. Finally, release the fascial tension in the palms of the hands. This sequence follows the body's natural hierarchy of tension development, releasing in reverse order how stress accumulates under pressure. It's not relaxation for comfort, but precision decontraction for heightened awareness. The third element is what I call friction-free reception, a mental technique that differs fundamentally from both Eastern passive acceptance and Western active problem solving. It's the ability to receive information without resistance, but also without surrender, maintaining what I call tensionless attention. Imagine holding a priceless glass orb, neither gripping it so tightly it breaks, nor so loosely it falls. This perfect tension-free engagement allows reality to register in your consciousness without distortion. Together, these three elements create stop-hit consciousness, a state where emotional momentum is neither suppressed nor indulged, but channeled with precision. It's not emptiness, but directed potentiality, the position from which all effective decisions originate. This approach differs fundamentally from the Eastern meditation techniques that became popular in America by 1972. Those methods often separate consciousness from action. Stop-hit consciousness instead creates a heightened engagement with reality, a state of perfect readiness without tension. In 1971, when negotiating with Warner Brothers executives about creative control of my films, I entered meetings having already established stop-hit consciousness. While they prepared elaborate arguments and counter-arguments, I positioned myself at the invisible pivot of the conversation, the unacknowledged center around which their concerns actually revolved. From this position, I could intercept objections before they fully formed and redirect momentum without creating resistance. The result wasn't the appearance of power, but actual leverage, the ability to direct outcomes without force. Stop-hit consciousness isn't the end goal. It's the foundation that makes the second principle possible, what I call Triad Perception. Once stop-hit consciousness establishes the position of advantage, the second principle activates what I call Triad Perception. This isn't merely seeing clearly, it's seeing comprehensively, from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Most decision failures stem not from insufficient information, but from distorted perception. The Western mind typically oscillates between two poles, seeing what it hopes to be true or seeing what it fears to be true. This binary perception creates a false dilemma where only two options appear possible. Triad perception breaks this pattern by establishing three distinct viewing positions that function as a unified perceptual system. Like a camera with three lenses capturing the same subject from different angles, this approach reveals dimensions invisible to conventional sight. The first perceptual position I call unvarnished recognition. This isn't merely separating fact from interpretation. It's recognizing that what we call facts are themselves interpretations. The technique requires identifying what I call contact points, the raw sensory data before the mind processes it. In practice, ask yourself, what would a camera record in this situation? What would a microphone record? Distinguish between what your senses detect and what your mind adds. For example, when someone speaks, separate their exact words from your interpretation of their meaning. I developed a specific technique to support this called factual anchoring. When examining any situation, place your thumb and forefinger together and mentally associate this physical gesture with pure observation. This creates a neurological interrupt that temporarily suspends interpretation. In 1972, during negotiations for Enter the Dragon, the studio executives presented what they called standard contract terms. Using unvarnished recognition, I was able to perceive that what they labeled standard was actually highly unusual for a leading actor. This perception wasn't emotional reaction, but precise recognition of reality without distortion. The second perceptual position is core intention mapping. This technique identifies the genuine aim beneath surface objectives. Most people become attached to specific pathways rather than true destinations, creating unnecessary constraints. The method requires asking 3 sequential questions. What do I want to accomplish? Then, why do I want to accomplish this? And finally, what does this allow that matters most? This progression reveals what I call the nucleus aim, the essential objective often hidden beneath layers of assumed necessities. During my discussions with Warner Brothers, my surface objective was creative control over fight choreography. By applying core intention mapping, I recognized my nucleus aim wasn't control itself, but authentic expression of my art form. This clarity revealed multiple pathways to achieve the essential aim beyond the apparent conflict over contractual language. The third perceptual position is what I call constraint authentication. This technique distinguishes genuine limitations from imagined barriers. The mind typically projects past failures into future scenarios, creating invisible restraints that don't actually exist. The method involves a specific probing sequence I developed. For each perceived constraint, ask, is this limitation physical, social, or self-imposed? Then, has this constraint been directly tested or merely assumed? Finally, what would immediately disprove this limitation? This isn't positive thinking. It's rigorous examination of assumed boundaries. The result isn't optimism, but accuracy. What unifies these 3 perceptions is a technique I developed called the triple strike awareness, the ability to hold all 3 perspectives simultaneously rather than sequentially. Like throwing 3 punches that land as one, triple strike awareness delivers comprehensive understanding in a single moment of clarity. Supporting this unified perception is what I call the self-deception finger technique. This precise method identifies personal biases by applying physical pressure to trigger awareness of unconscious distortions. Place your index finger against your temple and apply moderate pressure while reviewing your perception of a situation. This specific point activates what acupuncturists call the truth meridian. The slight discomfort creates what psychologists now term pattern interruption, momentarily revealing biases normally hidden from conscious awareness. When I applied Triad Perception during negotiations with Hong Kong producers in 1970, I was able to perceive not just their stated positions, but the underlying concerns driving their resistance. While others saw only conflict, I perceived the invisible pivot around which the entire disagreement revolved, concerns about market positioning that weren't being directly expressed. Triad Perception doesn't simply provide clearer vision. It reveals entirely new dimensions of possibility. It creates what I call decision space, the expanded field of options that becomes visible only when perception transcends binary limitations. This comprehensive perception forms the foundation for the third principle, what I call broken rhythm mastery. The third principle of the invisible pivot method I call broken rhythm mastery. This concept emerged from my fighting philosophy, but applies with equal power to decision-making under pressure. Most people approach decisions with predictable mental patterns. They advance directly towards solutions or retreat from difficulties in consistent rhythm. This predictability creates vulnerability in combat and in critical choices. Broken rhythm mastery operates on a different principle, the strategic disruption of expected patterns to create decisive advantage. The superior mind doesn't just process information efficiently, it processes it unpredictably, making leaps that conventional thinking cannot anticipate or counter. I developed this approach after studying why traditional decision methods fail under pressure. They follow consistent cadences of thought, logical progressions that become traps rather than tools when situations demand creative resolution. The method consists of what I call productive tension framework, a systematic approach to generating breakthrough insights through the deliberate creation and resolution of opposing forces. The first element is what I call the yielding position. This isn't passive acceptance, but strategic absorption, the temporary adoption of an approach that flows with existing momentum rather than opposing it. In combat, this might mean physically moving with an opponent's attack. In decision-making, it means fully embracing a perspective that conflicts with your initial inclination. For example, when Warner Brothers insisted my fighting scenes be choreographed by their staff in 1973, my yielding position was to fully explore what their approach might accomplish if accepted completely, not as compromise, but as possibility. The technique requires what I call complete provisional embodiment, the ability to temporarily inhabit an opposing view with full commitment. This isn't playing devil's advocate, it's becoming the devil, fully engaging the logic, emotion, and perspective of the opposing position. The second element is the advancing position. This isn't merely asserting your preferred approach, but strategically intensifying it to reveal its ultimate expression. By pushing your initial inclination to its logical extreme, you expose both its highest potential and its inherent limitations. When developing fight choreography for Enter the Dragon, I applied this technique by taking my initial concepts to their purest expression, beyond what would be commercially acceptable, to identify the essential elements that could not be compromised. The technique I developed for this is called essential distillation, systematically intensifying an approach until only its indispensable elements remain. This isn't stubbornness, but clarity through amplification. What makes this approach powerful isn't holding these opposites in static tension, but creating what I call harmonic collision, the deliberate bringing together of yielding and advancing approaches at precisely the right moment to generate a transcendent third option. Unlike compromise, which weakens both positions, harmonic collision creates a synthesis that preserves the essential strength of each while transcending their individual limitations. The timing of this collision is crucial. Too early produces premature compromise. Too late produces entrenched conflict. I developed a specific timing technique called intercepting point identification, recognizing the exact moment when opposing approaches are most productively combined. This isn't intuition, but precision. The recognition of what I call the fertile moment, when breakthrough becomes possible. The final element of broken rhythm mastery is what I call the framework abandonment position. This isn't merely thinking outside the box. It's recognizing when the entire conceptual structure must be discarded to achieve breakthrough. The technique requires what I developed as conceptual deframing, the systematic questioning of assumptions so fundamental they've become invisible. This isn't brainstorming, but precision deconstruction of the unstated premises that constrain perception. In 1973, when faced with a critical career decision between competing film opportunities, I applied broken rhythm mastery by first fully exploring the Hollywood path, yielding, then intensifying my commitment to Hong Kong cinema, advancing, creating a synthesis that preserved artistic integrity while expanding commercial reach, harmonic collision, and finally questioning whether film itself was the right medium for my expression, framework abandonment. The result wasn't incremental improvement, but breakthrough, a completely new approach that traditional decision methods could never have produced. What distinguishes broken rhythm mastery from conventional creative thinking is its systematic precision. The unpredictability isn't random but strategically deployed, like a fighter whose broken rhythm follows a pattern visible only to himself. This principle creates what I call decision leverage, the ability to produce maximum impact from minimum effort by applying force at precisely the right point, in precisely the right sequence, with precisely the right timing. Broken rhythm mastery prepares the mind for the final principle, what I call lightning execution. The final principle of the invisible pivot method I call lightning execution. A decision without implementation is merely an opinion. Even the clearest insight remains powerless until translated into decisive action. Most decision methods neglect this crucial phase. They focus on selection, but ignore execution, creating what I call phantom decisions that never materialize into reality. A decision truly exists only in its implementation. Lightning execution isn't merely taking action, it's taking precisely the right action with absolute commitment. Like my 1-inch punch that can send a man flying with minimal movement, this principle generates maximum impact through perfect focus rather than dispersed effort. The method consists of 3 precision elements that transform decision into reality with what I call concentrated totality, the complete integration of mind, emotion, and physical action. The first element is maximum leverage identification. Every situation, no matter how complex, contains what I call the decisive point, the exact position where minimal effort produces maximum effect. Finding this point requires seeing beyond obvious action paths to identify the fulcrum around which the entire situation pivots. The technique I developed requires what I call structural perception, seeing not just the components of a situation, but the invisible relationships between them. Like an architect who identifies the keystone that supports an entire arch, this perception reveals where precise pressure will shift the entire system. In 1972, when Hollywood producers initially dismissed my concept for The Way of the Dragon, I identified the decisive point wasn't winning creative arguments, but demonstrating market potential in Hong Kong first. Rather than fighting established power structures directly, I applied pressure at the system's point of greatest sensitivity, commercial viability. The second element is what I call kinesthetic commitment programming. This technique transcends conventional visualization by integrating physical sensation with mental rehearsal. The body doesn't distinguish between vividly imagined action and actual experience, a principle I applied in both martial arts training and decision implementation. The method requires what I developed as neural pathway activation, physically rehearsing the initial action that implements a decision while in a state of complete sensory engagement. This isn't abstract planning, but embodied preparation that programs the nervous system for seamless execution. The technique works through a specific sequence. First, physically assume the exact position from which action will initiate. Then, perform the precise initial movement required to implement the decision while intensively focusing on sensory feedback, the feeling of movement, the sound it creates, the visual experience. Finally, mentally trace the complete action sequence while maintaining physical connection to its initiation point. This method eliminates the hesitation gap that typically occurs between decision and action, what psychologists now call implementation delay. By neurologically preloading the action pattern, execution becomes instant and automatic. The third element is commitment integrity maintenance, sustaining decision momentum against inevitable resistance. Most decisions fail not at selection or initiation, but midway through implementation when unexpected obstacles arise. I developed a specific technique called pressure point inoculation to maintain commitment integrity under duress. The method systematically identifies potential pressure points where commitment might falter, then deliberately pre-exposes the mind to these challenges while in a state of heightened resolve. For each potential obstacle, I create what I call a response pattern, a predetermined reaction that maintains momentum through difficulty. This isn't rigid planning, but strategic preparation that frees the mind to maintain focus rather than being diverted into reactive problem solving. When facing discrimination in Hollywood during the early 1970s, I applied this technique by identifying specifically where and how cultural barriers would emerge, then developing precise response patterns for each scenario. Rather than being surprised and derailed by resistance, I had already established how to maintain momentum through these pressure points. What unifies these elements is what I call simultaneous expression and suppression, the ability to fully commit to the chosen path, while simultaneously restraining irrelevant alternatives. This isn't elimination of options, but perfect concentration of energy. In combat, this principle manifests as my ability to express one technique with complete commitment while suppressing all others. In decision execution, it manifests as total focus on implementation without the dispersal of energy into reconsidering alternatives or second-guessing. I developed a physical anchoring technique to support this mental discipline. When executing a decision, firmly press your feet into the ground while extending forward through your center line. This posture neurologically triggers what I call directional commitment, the physical sensation of unwavering forward movement. Lightning execution transforms the invisible power of clarity into visible results. It is the bridge between internal decision and external reality, the moment when thought becomes action, when potential becomes kinetic. The principle is captured in a training phrase I developed: be formless in consideration, but unsurmountable in execution. This balance of adaptability and determination creates what I call decision momentum, the irresistible force that emerges when clarity combines with commitment. These four principles, stop-hit consciousness, triad perception, broken rhythm mastery, and lightning execution, might appear to be sequential steps. They are not. They function as a unified system, flowing together to create what I call emotional momentum, perhaps my most significant discovery about human performance under pressure. Most decision approaches make a fundamental error. They treat emotion as an obstacle to clarity. Corporate America's decision models of the early 1970s advocate mechanical processes that attempt to eliminate feeling from the equation. Eastern traditions often suggest detachment from emotion. Both approaches misunderstand the true nature of decision power. Emotional energy isn't the enemy of clear decision-making. It's the fuel. The untrained mind is pushed chaotically by emotions. The trained mind rides them like a surfer rides waves, using their energy rather than being overwhelmed by it. What I discovered through years of experimentation is that emotions contain directional force. They aren't random disruptions, but signals carrying essential information about optimal action paths. The key isn't suppression, but redirection, transforming emotional energy from chaotic disturbance into focused power. My intercepting method in combat doesn't block an opponent's energy. It captures and redirects it. The same principle applies to decision clarity. Emotional momentum doesn't resist feelings, but intercepts them at precisely the right moment, redirecting their energy toward your chosen objective. The four principles operate as a continuous circuit, not a linear progression. Stop-hit consciousness creates perceptual clarity that enables triad perception. Triad perception reveals possibilities that broken rhythm mastery transforms into breakthrough solutions, and lightning execution channels the resulting clarity into decisive action. But what powers this entire system, what makes it dynamic rather than mechanical, is the deliberate channeling of emotional energy throughout the circuit. Like electricity flowing through a system, emotion provides the activation energy that transforms understanding into action. I developed a specific physical movement to demonstrate this unified flow. Stand with feet shoulder-width apart. Begin a circular motion with your right hand, palm facing inward near your center. As the hand moves upward, transition to triad perception by extending 3 fingers. Continue the circle outward to represent broken rhythm mastery, changing the hand position to show disruption. Complete the circle with a forward striking motion representing lightning execution. The continuous nature of this movement, with no distinct beginning or end, illustrates how these principles function as a unified whole. This integration creates what I call decision resonance, when all faculties align to produce clarity that's not merely intellectual but visceral. You don't just know the right decision, you feel it with absolute certainty. In 1973, when choosing between multiple film opportunities, conventional analysis suggested accepting the highest-paying Hollywood offer. Industry experts presented elaborate decision matrices weighing factors like exposure, compensation, and career trajectory. Their mechanical approach reflected the dominant business thinking of that era, treating decisions as mathematical equations rather than dynamic human processes. Instead, I applied emotional momentum. I didn't suppress my frustration with Hollywood stereotyping. I redirected that emotional energy into clarity about what mattered most. The result wasn't compromise, but transcendence, creating my own production that satisfied both artistic integrity and commercial viability. This approach differs fundamentally from both Western analytical methods and Eastern contemplative traditions. It doesn't separate thought from feeling, but integrates them into a unified decision system more powerful than either alone. The corporate world of the early 1970s was obsessed with decision methodologies imported from military and engineering fields. Flowcharts, decision trees, utility calculations. These approaches treated humans as walking computers, ignoring the essential role of emotional energy in activating decisions. What makes the invisible pivot method revolutionary isn't its complexity, but its recognition of a fundamental truth. Decision clarity emerges at the intersection of precise thinking and directed feeling. The invisible pivot isn't just the still point within chaos. It's the exact position where intellectual understanding and emotional energy amplify rather than oppose each other. This unified approach creates what I call decision authority, the unmistakable quality of choices made with both complete clarity and absolute conviction. Not the brittle certainty of the fanatic or the hesitant qualification of the overthinker, but the grounded confidence that emerges when all aspects of consciousness align around a single point of focus. Understanding principles without application creates merely theoretical knowledge. Let me demonstrate how the invisible pivot method functions in 3 distinct pressure scenarios I've personally navigated. The contexts differ dramatically, but the principles remain constant, adapting like water to different containers while maintaining their essential nature. First, consider physical confrontation, an area where decision clarity directly impacts survival. In 1964, I faced a challenge from a rival martial artist in San Francisco's Chinatown. Traditional responses offered 2 options: public confrontation risking escalation or withdrawal risking reputation damage. Both seemed inadequate. Applying stop-hit consciousness, I intercepted my initial reactivity, neither suppressing anger nor being controlled by it, but establishing perceptual advantage through rhythmic circuit breathing and targeted decontraction. This created immediate clarity distinct from both aggression and passivity. With Triad Perception, I recognized the unvarnished situation. The challenge was politically motivated, designed to establish territorial dominance in the martial arts community. My core intention wasn't proving superiority, but authentic expression of my art. And the actual constraints weren't physical limitations, but cultural expectations about how conflicts should be resolved. Broken rhythm mastery revealed an approach beyond the expected binary. I proposed a private demonstration rather than public confrontation. This unexpected rhythm disrupted the anticipated conflict pattern while preserving essential elements of both positions. The verification of skill without public spectacle. Lightning execution required identifying the decisive point, timing the private demonstration to maximize community awareness while minimizing direct confrontation. The kinesthetic commitment involved physically rehearsing the exact techniques I would demonstrate. Commitment integrity was maintained by preparing specific responses for potential escalation scenarios. The result wasn't compromise, but transcendence, a resolution that satisfied honor requirements while avoiding the expected confrontation pattern. The approach preserved reputation while preventing unnecessary conflict, creating what I call decision elegance, maximum effect through minimum force. The second scenario involves a career decision that many of you might relate to. In 1971, I faced competing film opportunities, one offering financial security but creative limitation, another offering artistic freedom but financial uncertainty. The pressures were immense, with family obligations and career trajectory hanging in the balance. Applying stop-hit consciousness, I established perceptual advantage by intercepting both fear of financial insecurity and attachment to creative ideals, creating space for clear seeing beyond emotional reactivity. Triad Perception revealed the underlying structure. The industry's unspoken racial barriers were the actual constraint, not the specific contract terms being offered. My core intention wasn't status or security, but creating authentic representation that would transform opportunities for others. The unvarnished reality was that neither option fully addressed the fundamental challenge. Broken rhythm mastery generated an unexpected approach. Rather than choosing between existing options, I created a third path, developing my own production with Hong Kong financing, but designed for international distribution. This broken rhythm disrupted industry expectations while preserving essential elements of both security and creative control. Lightning execution required identifying the decisive point, strategic partnerships with specific producers who recognize the untapped market potential. The kinesthetic commitment involved physically creating preliminary choreography to demonstrate my vision. Commitment integrity was maintained by establishing specific decision milestones that would trigger adaptation if necessary. The result wasn't incremental improvement, but breakthrough, creating a new model that industry experts considered impossible given the constraints of that era. The approach didn't just advance my career, but transformed possibilities for others facing similar barriers. The third scenario touches on personal relationships, perhaps the area where emotional pressure most severely impacts decision clarity. In 1965, I faced intense cultural conflict surrounding my marriage to Linda, with opposition from both American and Chinese communities during a period of significant racial tension. Applying stop-hit consciousness, I intercepted both defensive anger and desire for approval, establishing perceptual advantage beyond the polarized reactions these pressures typically generate. Triad Perception revealed the situation's true structure. The opposition reflected deeper cultural insecurities rather than specific objections. My core intention wasn't social acceptance, but authentic relationship integrity. The actual constraints weren't external disapproval, but internalized cultural expectations we both carried. Broken rhythm mastery generated an approach that transcended the expected binary of either conforming to tradition or rejecting it completely. Instead, we created selective integration, honoring essential elements from both cultures while establishing our own distinct patterns. This broken rhythm disrupted expected conflict cycles while preserving meaningful connections. Lightning execution required identifying the decisive point, creating specific relationship rituals that demonstrated respect for both traditions while establishing our independence. The kinesthetic commitment involved physically practicing how we would navigate specific family interactions. Commitment integrity was maintained by establishing mutual support protocols for high-pressure social situations. The result wasn't compromise, but integration, a relationship model that honored heritage while transcending limitation. The approach didn't just resolve our specific challenge, but created a template for others navigating similar cultural complexities. To develop this decision clarity yourself, I've created what I call the Daily Decision Journal, a structured practice method that develops these capabilities systematically rather than haphazardly. The method involves selecting one decision daily, beginning with low-pressure choices and progressively addressing more consequential matters. For each decision, document your application of the 4 principles with specific attention to emotional momentum. Record not just what you decided, but how the decision emerged, the quality of awareness, the perceptual shifts, the rhythm disruptions, and the execution pathway. Review these journals weekly, looking specifically for pattern recognition, how certain emotional signatures correlate with decision quality. This practice creates what I call decision intelligence, the accumulated wisdom that emerges not from abstract knowledge, but from deliberate practice. Begin with decisions that carry minimal consequences, then progressively apply the method to more significant challenges as your capabilities develop. Like martial arts training, mastery comes not from understanding, but from embodiment, the integration of principles into spontaneous capacity. The goal isn't perfect decisions, but decision mastery, the ability to find clarity precisely when pressure is highest and stakes are greatest. Not through rigid formulas, but through dynamic responsiveness centered around the invisible pivot. We began by observing how the tornado's destructive power swirls around a perfectly still center. This invisible pivot, the quiet eye within the storm, contains the essence of decision mastery under pressure. What I've shared with you isn't theory, but tested methodology, principles proven in combat, in business negotiation, in personal challenge. Yet knowing these principles intellectually creates only the illusion of understanding. True mastery emerges through embodiment, when concepts transform from ideas you possess to qualities that possess you. The invisible pivot method reveals a fundamental truth. Decision clarity doesn't come from accumulating more information, more analysis, more options. It comes from locating the precise point where complexity resolves into simplicity, where the essential nature of any situation becomes self-evident. This approach has transformed my life not by making existence easier, but by making it more penetrable. The same pressures and challenges remain, but their power to create confusion dissolves when perceived from the invisible pivot. What once appeared as unsolvable problems reveal themselves as unexplored opportunities when approached through this method. In 1970, a renowned martial arts master asked me about my secret to fighting multiple opponents simultaneously. He expected techniques or strategies. My answer disappointed him. I fight one man at a time. I simply do it very quickly. The same principle applies to decisions under pressure. You don't solve multiple problems simultaneously. You identify the invisible pivot around which all aspects revolve, and address that singular point with absolute clarity. The paradox of this method is that the invisible pivot becomes visible only when you stop searching for it directly. Like trying to see a dim star in the night sky, it appears only when you look slightly away from it. The harder you strain to find clarity, the more it eludes you. When you establish the conditions for clear seeing, through the 4 principles we've explored, the invisible pivot reveals itself without effort. Do not merely collect these ideas. Do not simply agree with them. Test them under pressure. Apply them when clarity seems impossible. Embody them until they become not what you do, but what you are. Decision mastery isn't a destination, but a path, one that never ends but continuously deepens. Each application of these principles reveals new dimensions of possibility, new capacities for clarity under conditions that would render others blind. Remember, the most powerful decisions often appear not as dramatic choices, but as inevitable recognitions. Moments when reality becomes so clear that action flows naturally from perception. Not, what should I do? But, how could I do otherwise? Seeing so clearly. The strength of the invisible pivot method isn't that it makes decisions for you, but that it reveals decisions already present beneath the surface of confusion, like a sculptor removing excess stone to reveal the form already waiting within. Clear decision emerges not from adding complexity, but from finding simplicity. Not from accumulating options, but from penetrating to essence. Not from what you bring to the situation, but from what you discover at its core. The invisible pivot awaits your discovery, not as abstract concept, but as lived experience. The only question that remains is, will you find it?